Hello, everyone. Welcome to the gathering. So glad you decided to spend your evening with us today. I'm glancing, I don't see any first-timers. Looks like we're all regulars, which is great. If you're willing and able, I invite us to stand and participate in however we feel led to participate in singing. Blessed be your name, the land that is plentiful, where streams of abundance flow. Lord, blessed be your name. Blessed be your name, when I'm found in the desert place. Though I walk through the wilderness, Lord, blessed be your name. Every blessing you pour out, I'll turn back to praise. When the darkness closes in, Lord, still I will sing. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your glorious name. Blessed be your name, when the sun's shining down on me, when the world's all as it should be. Lord, blessed be your name. Blessed be your name, on the road marked with suffering, though there's pain in the offering. Lord, blessed be your name. 'Cause every blessing you pour out, I'll turn back to praise. When the darkness closes in, Lord, still I will sing. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your glorious name. For you give and take away. You give and take away. My heart will choose to say, Lord, blessed be your name. Oh, you give and take away. You give and take away. My heart will choose to say, Lord, blessed be your name. And every blessing you pour out, I'll turn back to praise. When the darkness closes in, Lord, still I will say, blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your glorious name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your name, Jesus. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your glorious name. For you give and take away. You give and take away. My heart will choose to say, Lord, blessed be your name. For you give and take away. You give and take away. My heart will choose to say, Lord, blessed be your name. Welcome again to the gathering. I invite you to remain standing if you're already, and just move around, get to know each other just a little bit more. Enjoy this time of fellowship. God, as we enter into your presence, I pray that you would allow us to leave this week behind, but not forget it completely. Lord, for us to lay it down at your feet. For in your presence is where we will find freedom. As we sing your songs, as we learn more about you and read your word, I pray that we would learn more about ourselves and how we fit into your kingdom that is here and is to come. About your love that never fails, that never lets us down. Even when it seems that all is lost, when we're confused and just having the worst day ever, Lord, that we can look to you and know that you love us. Let's lift our voices as we sing Your Love Never Fails. Separate, even if I run away, and your love never fails. I know I still make mistakes, but you have new mercies for me every day, and your love never fails. You stay the same through the ages. Your love never changes. There may be pain in the night, but joy comes in the morning. Yeah. And when the oceans rage, I don't have to be afraid, because I know that you love me. Your love never fails. No, your love never fails. The wind is strong and the water's deep, but I'm not alone here in these open seas, and your love never fails. Chasm is far too wide. I never thought I'd reach the other side, but your love never fails. 'Cause you stay the same through the ages. Your love never changes. There may be pain in the night, but joy comes in the morning. Yeah. And when the ocean rains, I don't have to be afraid, because I know that you love me. Your love never fails. Oh no, Lord, sing your love never fails. 'Cause you make all things work together for my good. You make all things work together for my good. You make all things work together for my good. Help me believe, Lord. All things work together for my good. For us, for all you make, all things work together for my good. Your glory, all things work together for my good. Can you stay the same? You stay the same through the ages. Your love never changes. There may be pain in the night, but joy comes in the morning, yeah. And when the ocean 'cause I know that you love me. Your love never fails. Your love never fails. 'Cause you hear me when I call. You are my morning song. Though darkness fills the night, it cannot hide the light. Whom shall I fear? You crush the enemy underneath my feet. You are my sword and shield, though troubles linger still. Whom shall I fear? I know who goes before me. I know who stands behind. The God of angel armies is always by my side. The one who reigns forever, he is a friend of mine. The God of angel armies is always by my side. Yeah, my strength is in your name, for you alone can save. You will deliver me. Yours is the victory. And whom shall I fear? Oh, whom shall I fear? I know who goes before me. I know who stands behind. The God of angel armies is always by my side. The one who reigns forever, he is a friend of mine. The God of angel armies is always by my side. And nothing formed against me shall stand. 'Cause you hold the whole world in your hand. 'Cause I'm holding on to your promises. You are faithful, God, you are faithful. No, nothing formed against me shall stand. 'Cause you hold the whole world in your hand. 'Cause I'm holding on to your promises. You are faithful, you are faithful, you are faithful. I know who goes before me. I know who stands behind. The God of angel armies is always by my side. The one who reigns forever, he is a friend of mine. The God of angel armies is always by my side. I know who goes before me. I know who stands behind. The God of angel armies is always by my side. The one who reigns forever, he is a friend of mine. The God of angel armies is always by my side. The God of angel armies is always by my side.
Y'all can be seated. Anna's so tall. This is like... I must say, it's really nice to have fellow swayers and dancers with me tonight. I'm talking to Anne and Karen Folgate. It's nice I'm not the only one. Our scripture reading tonight is from Genesis chapter 18, 1 through 15, as well as chapter 21, 1 through 7. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre, as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. He said, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring you a little bread that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." So they said, "Do as you have said." And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, knead it, and make cakes." Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant, who hastened to prepare it. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree while they ate. They said to him, "Where is your wife Sarah?" And he said, "There in the tent." Then one said, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I have grown old, and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid. He said, "Oh yes, you did laugh." The Lord dealt with Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to his son, whom Sarah bore him. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Now Sarah said, "God has brought laughter from me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me." And she said, "Who would have ever said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." With this scripture on our mind of promises and longings, we come to our time of prayer. And the way it works at the gathering is through candle lighting. You can come and light a prayer in silence and just an unspoken prayer. You're also welcome to light a candle and share it with the group, and we will respond with, "Lord, hear our prayer." We have several pastoral care concerns right now in our congregation that I'll be lighting candles for. I pray for John Pipe, who's in the hospital still. Not sure how he is going to heal and whatnot, so it's a lot of unknown for Carol. Also pray for Dina Stanton, who's dealing with a very painful T12 compression fracture. I don't know what that is, but it sounds truly painful, yeah. And there was one more I had on my mind. What was it? Kit Troyer died? Yeah, Kit Troyer passed away. There was one more. Yes, Gordon. He had a heart procedure this week, and he called Morgan from his hospital bed to instruct her to do something, and she was like, "Shut up, like you're recovering, like hang up." So Gordon's fine. He's being Gordon, of course, but just, prayers for recovery and such. And Ruth Shanklin has moved to rehab, so just prayers as she recovers.
Lord, hear our prayer. Lord, hear our prayer.
I'm going to light 2 candles tonight. This weekend is the anniversary of my mom's death, 27 years. But the one that's more on my mind tonight, actually, is a massage therapist that both Linea and I knew, 23, black male, was a runner and was going to the store at night running because he ran a lot. He ran marathons, and wore hat, ski mask because he was anemic and got cold easily. But unfortunately, this happened a couple weeks ago, and we just found out 3 police tackled him, thinking that he was doing something illegal when he was just going to the store. They called an ambulance because he was very freaked out. The ambulance gave him something to calm him down, had a cardiac arrest, and now he's passed. So just goes to show you that, there's still a lot of work to be done with racism in the United States, that you should be able to go to the store, and he was getting tea for his sister. So his name was Elijah.
Lord, hear our prayer.
I have a prayer of deep gratitude today for my pastor and mentor who is celebrating his 30th anniversary at my home church in Dallas. I was not able to be there this weekend to celebrate with him, but watched at least the morning service this afternoon, which was beautiful, a tribute to his 3 decades of ministry. So anything about me that is good as a pastor, I learned from him. Anything that is not good, it's all me, my responsibility. But I truly feel blessed to have such a great now colleague in ministry. George Mason.
Lord, hear our prayer.
Just pretend I lit one. Yes. I just wanted to do a prayer of thanksgiving for my parents because it's their 51st anniversary yesterday. So pray for more happy, healthy years together.
51 more years.
Yeah.
Lord, hear our prayer. Fullness of eternal promise, stirring in your sons and daughters, earth revealing heaven's wonders. Spirit come, Spirit come. What you spoke is now unfolding. All your children shall be holding. Dreams awaken in this moment. Spirit come, Spirit come. Pour it out, let your love run over. Here and now, let your glory fill this house. Pour it out. let your love run over. Here and now, let your glory fill this house. 'Cause now the world awaits your presence, and this power is within us. 'Cause we will rise to be your witness. And Spirit come, Spirit come, pour it out, let your love run over. Here and now, let your glory fill this house. Pour it out, let your love run over. Here and now, let your glory fill this house. Come and fill this place, God, with your Spirit, with your presence, Lord. Tongues of fire, testifying of the Son, one desire. Spirit come, speak revival. Prophesy like it is done, one desire. Spirit come, tongues of fire, testifying of the Son, one desire. Spirit come, speak revival. Prophesy like it is done, one desire. Spirit come, Let our hearts continue burning, for our King is soon returning. As we hold to this assurance, Spirit come, Spirit come, Spirit come, Spirit come. Pour it out, let your love run over. Here and now, let your glory fill this house. Pour it out, let your love run over.
With a rather dark sense of humor, the Irish writer Jonathan Swift said, "Promises like pie crusts are made to be broken." It's depressing, isn't it? Yes, I suppose. Rick says, unless you can just think about the pie. Honestly, when you look at our world, it can feel this way, right? That every promise that we see made is broken. Politicians make campaign promises that they know good and well, once they get elected, they're not going to be able to keep. Even with the best intentions, parents make promises to their children that they desperately want to keep, but because of how life circumstances unfold, they don't. And when we marry, partners make promises, right? We vow to keep together for better, for worse, till death do us part. But then, often, over 50% of the time, actually, in the United States, something other than death causes us to part. Every 13 seconds, there is a divorce in America, which means there are 9 divorces in the 2 minutes it takes for a couple to recite their wedding vows. 554 divorces occur during your typical 2-hour romantic comedy movie. 1,385 divorces happen during the average 5-hour wedding reception. That's some major dancing going on there. And there are 19,353,568 divorces that occur over the course of an average first-year marriage that lasts 8 years and ends, of course, in divorce. I find it really depressing that there is a website dedicated to calculating these statistics. Statistics of how we break our promises to one another. Do you know what there's not a website for? The number of promises kept. If you're looking for a side project, there you go. And I think it's because promises kept, well, first of all, they're not salacious, so they don't make front page news. But it's also the nature of promises that we expect them to be kept, and it's only when they're not kept that we take notice, right? Otherwise, we take them for granted. And I suppose we can all expect a certain number of broken promises from people. We are all only human, after all. But what about promises from God? Are they any different? Today, as we continue with our narrative lectionary journey in this series of Rooted, we get a close-up view of one of God's promises, and we get that close-up view through the lens of laughter. In today's story, we see cynical laughter turn to celebratory laughter. And laughter, according to this story, as it turns out, is a good indicator as to whether we believe that God will keep God's promises to us. Because looking at our laughter enables us to kind of gauge our ability and our willingness to suspend our reason and rationale for the space that can come with surprise or with hope, with maybe even room for a miracle. Genesis 18 and 21 give us an amazing example of what it means to be rooted in promise, even when the fulfillment of that promise is long past due and is no longer even plausible by human metrics. So today, we're joining the story of Abraham and Sarah at a midpoint, or mid-promise, you might say. Remember that Abram and Sarah have had many heartbreaking years of waiting and disappointment that they've endured together as a childless couple. And this is a circumstance that has brought them not only tremendous personal pain, but also public shame. Way back in Genesis 12, God makes a promise to a man called then Abram, whose wife Sarai was told that she was barren, and now they knew at least why they weren't conceiving. And this promise that God makes to Abram is threefold. He's going to have land, he's going to have a great nation, that is, he's going to have a lot of descendants, and 3, he will be blessed to be a blessing. God says, in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now, for our purposes today, it's really the birth of the child, or the lack thereof, this promise that's hidden behind door number 2, if you will, in this threefold promise, that really matters, because without that, the other promises don't even happen. And yet, Sarai remains barren. She and Abram have no child, and they grow old. Jump a few chapters over to chapter 15. God speaks to Abram again, renewing the promise. He takes him outside on a beautiful Colorado night, shows him all of the stars, and says, "Look toward the heavens and count the stars, and as numerous as those are, that is how many descendants you will have." But you can't have a sky full of descendants when you don't even have one child. And Sarai remains barren. She and Abram have no child, and they grow older still. So it's understandable that in Genesis 16, one chapter later, Sarai is tired of waiting for this promised child, and she takes this promise into her own hands, probably to give herself a sense of agency and power in what was a very powerless situation for her. So she actually suggests to Abram that he should sleep with her servant, Hagar, so that she can conceive a son for them. And Abram says, okay, and he does, and they get a child, Ishmael, and Abram at this point is 86 years old. But really, this only halfway fulfilled the promise, because Sarai is left out of this, and isn't she part of this covenant? Even though she tried to take the promise into her own hands and thought she had fulfilled it for Abram and for, quote unquote, the outside world, God did not give up on the promise for her. In Genesis 17, God appears again to Abram to repeat the promise yet another time. And this is when their names get changed to Abraham and Sarah. God says, "I have made you the ancestor of a multitude of nations." Like, this is in the past tense. So speaking of Ishmael, but also implying this promise that is to come. And God is very specific in saying, "I will give you a son by Sarah." In other words, this little plan of Sarai's didn't work. There's still a son coming. Now, Abraham has quite a reaction to this. You've got to read this in the Bible for yourself, but chapter 17, verse 17, he falls on his face laughing. And then he does something even more unexpected. He asks God not to keep the promise that God has been making them all these years, because he's essentially saying his son with Hagar is enough. And perhaps I think he just wanted this painful saga to be over with. And he prays, "Lord, oh, that Ishmael might be alive in your sight. May he be enough." So this is all of the background that we need to know to allow us to land where our text is today, to truly understand just how much this promise had moved into Abraham and Sarah's lives and made itself at home in their souls, for better or worse. It's already been made clear that this promise that Abraham hears and that Sarah overhears from these three messengers in Genesis 18 is not a new promise, right? Which surely makes it super hard to believe. What kind of promise is harder to believe than a promise that has been repeatedly not kept? And what kind of promise maker is harder to believe than one who has continually not kept a promise? Surely, at some point, anger and resentment must start setting in here. It's been almost a half century of hearing this promise in their lives, and yet there is no child. And not even that, but Sarah knows she's way past the age of childbearing. And to hear this again and again must have felt like a slap in the face, like salt in the wound, like some kind of sick joke. Who in their right mind would continue to believe that the promise God had supposedly made to them would ever come true? They'd really be fools to have that kind of faith, wouldn't they? So when God, via these three messengers, yet again repeats the promise, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son," we can't blame Sarah for laughing, right? Verse 12 says, Sarah laughed to herself. And this phrase, "to herself," is a Hebrew word, bakirba. And it's important because it really means inside of herself, or in her guts, so to speak. So we can get two images here. One, that this is not a little side snicker that Sarah has, but this could really be a belly laugh in her guts, laughing at God, almost mocking God for this promise that's being made, but also coming from the abdominal area, reminding her that this is the very promise that she can't have. Her womb is barren. It's not just not possible, it's impossible to her. It's absurd, it's unfair, it's cruel, and it's kind of comical to her, I think, that God even continues to make this promise. I don't know about you, but for a lot of us, laughter can be a self-protection mechanism for us, kind of like a self-defense, that nervous kind of laughter. And I can imagine that this is the laughter that Sarah expresses here. With the pain of barrenness and the passing of all these years, what are these two supposed to do? At what point does their faith really become fantasy? Even if it means doubting and deflecting God's promises, this laughter is a true expression of the depths of Sarah's pain in her soul. However, even with this direct kind of response we have that seems to be a closed, a cynical laughter, there's also this coexisting response of openness in the text as well. And I think we really need to pay attention to this, because the role of hospitality in this story cannot be overlooked. Abraham and Sarah and their servant show extravagant welcome to these three strangers who come to their doorstep. And in the biblical world, hospitality is key to everything. It's not just a social virtue, it's really a sacred duty, a moral expectation. They were not hotels or inns back then, so when travelers came through town, all of your houses are potential Airbnbs. And long before there was 5-star ratings, there was 5-star hospitality as the norm. Now, the message of Genesis 18 is not that because Abraham and Sarah showed hospitality, that's why God then renewed and kept the promise. Rather, I think it's more nuanced and complex than this, and it's really been raising this question in me: what role does hospitality play in our lives and in our hearts in terms of making space for God to act and for God to make and to actually fulfill promises? In terms of keeping space in our hearts open to the unexpected, keeping us in a space where we can be surprised by grace. In other words, when we practice hospitality, whether it's to strangers or to friends, or even to just create some more space in our own hearts to love ourselves a bit more, then it seems like we're also creating a space for God to move and to act in our lives in a way that we could easily miss if we were so hyper-focused on ourselves. Hospitality helps us turn our attention outward and upward. When we loosen our grip on life, when we are more generous with what we have, could it be that we have eyes to see and ears to hear how God is being generous with us? Maybe there's a promise in the mix that we've been missing out on because we've been closed down to others and therefore to God, limiting our vision, living in that expected and predictable space instead of making ourselves vulnerable to the unexpected and the unpredictable. I don't know, but it's just a thought, because this story of a promise fulfilled is definitely tied to hospitality somehow. We can't ignore these two stories that are side by side. And I think that with this metaphor of creating space in our homes and therefore in our hearts for God, we can see that God doesn't work on our timetables, right? God just shows up unannounced, knocking at the door. Are we going to be the ones that just ignore that knock of God, ignore the knock of the stranger, and turn away and just hope that somebody else will help? Or will we open that door? Jesus tells us in Matthew's gospel that if we do it to the least of these, we do it to him, which means if we refuse shelter or refuse water to someone, that means we refuse that to him as well. Hospitality to the stranger and to the traveler, to the immigrant, to the refugee, these are core tenets of our faith. They're not an option. And yet, in the midst of this kind of example of radical hospitality we have in Genesis 18, we have this laugh at the end from Sarah. A cynical laugh, a tired laugh. It's the, yeah, right, kind of sarcastic laugh. And she's called out on it. And my favorite line of the text comes when the Lord says, "Oh, yes, you did laugh." What does that mean? If you know what that means, come talk to me after. I don't. It is such a weird line. I'm not sure why she gets called out on her laughter and Abraham doesn't. But whatever that line is about, it sets us up for what is to come. Because the most important phrase in this exchange comes after Sarah scoffs, "Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?" And it's when the messenger, when the Lord asks, "Is there anything too wonderful for the Lord?" That is the key to this whole passage. Sarah, who's been made cynical by the passing years, exhausted by God's unkept promises, afraid to even have hope again, clearly thinks that there are plenty of things too wonderful for the Lord. And yet, while she laughs cynically, we can imagine that God is smiling compassionately, knowing what is to come, because the story isn't over. So often in our lives, we stop the story before it's over. But God isn't finished. So we get to this second scene in Genesis 21, this scene that fulfills the promises made in Genesis 12, 15, 17, and 18. Isaac is born. If you know your Hebrew, you know Isaac means laughter. So Abraham laughs when he got this promise from God. Sarah laughs when she hears the promise from God. And when finally the promise comes, this little boy, Isaac, this bundle of laughter, I like to think that God got the last laugh, or the lasting laugh. Because did you note what Sarah says? She says, "God has brought laughter for me so that everyone who hears will laugh with me." This is a welcoming and embracing laughter of celebration, not cynicism. And this is what makes laughter such a fascinating thing to me, because it's malleable, right? It can change so quickly. Have you ever been laughing so hard that you cry? Or crying so hard that you then laugh? What is that about, right? Laughter reaches something deep inside of us, and sometimes a laughter that can be born of pain can become a laughter born of celebration. We see that here. I think most of the time we probably live in that space of Sarah's first laugh. Not because we have faith, but because we find it impossible to have faith on some days. It's a hard truth that's held up before us in this text, that most of the time, faith is not a reasonable act that we can make sense of in our heads. Most of the time, the promises of God are not little easy, cliche, conventional pieces of wisdom that can just be easily accommodated into our lives as they are. Rather, these promises completely uproot us, ironically, because faith requires risk and even some suspension of disbelief. Faith disrupts. To be rooted in promise may mean that we have to be uprooted by what we think is possible or even impractical. And to be rooted in faith may mean we have to uproot the messages that tell us that we are not worthy or deserving of God's promises. In the end, Abraham and Sarah laugh because they have reached a dead end in their lives and because they had adjusted to that dead end. They had gotten used to that as their new normal. And it's kind of a resignation to hopelessness in a way. And I wonder how many times we find ourselves looking at those barren places in our own lives. And we've become so blind to hope that we think no longer that God can do a new thing. When we hear that message, that's a human message. That's not the promise that we see in the Bible. The promise we see in the Bible is that God does a new thing over and over and over again. We can get so rooted in our pain that we forget about God's promises. This week, I invite you to listen to your own laughter. To listen to those times when you find yourself laughing maybe out of some discomfort. Someone says something that hurts you. You see something on the news that you just can't believe, and you sort of laugh with despair under your breath. You laugh maybe in an uncomfortable situation because you don't understand the social dynamics. Whatever it is, pay attention to those moments of laughter, because I think they can show us the places in our lives where we've become closed off, where we've kind of shut down as a self-defense mechanism. And what would the world look like if we could open up those places, if we could believe in promise and hope again, if we could have that belief that these things that seem impossible really are possible? It may not be that you can see a promise in your own life coming true, and that's okay. In those moments, I think we have to join Sarah in her laughter and just be reminded that for her, the promise was fulfilled. In the moments we can't see it in our own lives, we remember by looking at others and celebrating with them. To be rooted in promise is to remember that the promise is for you. You're not an exception to God's promise. Think about what could be fulfilled in your life. Open a space for something new to happen and invite God in. Amen.
Hey, so we're going to try something because I feel like this group is a comfortable group to do it with, and the last song that we're doing is semi-familiar for most of us as well. So Alice is going to turn off the lights for the house, as we would call it if we were in like a sanctuary. I might look like a ghost, so this is kind of not a final product, but it's just to kind of feel your opinion of what it's like to worship in this space with a little less light focused up here. Can you still see the hymnal? Can you still feel the presence of those around you? Those types of things. So be thinking about that, but also continue to enter into your own sense of worship during this time. Bless the Lord, oh my soul, oh my soul, worship His holy name, sing like never before, oh my soul, I worship your holy name. The sun comes up, it's a new day dawning. It's time to sing your song again. Whatever may pass and whatever lies before me, let me be singing when the evening comes. So bless the Lord, oh my soul, worship His holy name. Sing like never before, oh my soul, I will worship your holy name. For you're rich in love and you're slow to anger. Your name is great and your heart is kind. For all your goodness I will keep on singing. 10,000 reasons for my heart And on that day when my strength is failing, the end draws near and my time has come, still my soul will sing your praise unending. Yeah, 10,000 years and then forevermore. Oh, forevermore. So bless the Lord, oh my soul. Oh, my soul. Worship His holy name. I'll sing like never before. Oh, my soul, I will worship your holy name. And bless the Lord, oh, my soul. Oh, my soul, oh, worship your holy name. Sing like never before. Oh, my soul, I will worship your holy name. I'll worship your holy name. God, I will worship your holy name.
A little laughter before the benediction. We have 2 Colorado's Rockies tickets, compliments of Ron and Libby Johnson, looking for a new home. Wednesday, September 18th, 1:10 p.m. Anyone who's not working during the day, John, they go to you, the highest bidder. My task for the day is complete. So Sarah was 100 years plus when this promise was fulfilled. Hands raised, who's 100 years old? Good. So we all still have time. One of the things, there's so many things I could have mentioned in this sermon that I didn't, but I keep thinking about just because the promise was fulfilled does not mean that life was all of a sudden easy or good. Can you imagine raising a toddler or a teenager well into your hundreds? That seems kind of like a sick joke in and of itself. Remember that in the waiting for the promise to be fulfilled, to not get too caught up on the promise itself or whatever dream or prayer it is that you have before God, but to remember that the real promise is God's presence with us and our ability to be that presence of God to one another. And think maybe this week about how when you open your heart and your lives to others, you may be the one who helps a promise be fulfilled in that person's life. And what a gift that is. Go forth being rooted in the promise and being the promise. Amen.